LeClair has been a member of the Round Table for many years, and she is past president of the Round Table and has been reenacting also for many years. Nancy is a member of the Angels of the Battlefield and editor of their letter. Let's welcome Nancy and learn all about Helen Brainard Cole. Thank you, Nancy.
Okay. Which side do I go on? Helen was born in Oneida, New York in 1838. When she was 7 years old, her parents came to Sheboygan Falls. Her father was the blacksmith there. She was 23 when she was 20 when she married William Cole. 3 years later, they had a little daughter, and the following year, William died. It was 1862, and Helen's father left for the war. He was with the 20th Wisconsin. And Helen was very upset that she couldn't go and join with all the soldiers. She was just as patriotic as they were, and most of the nurses who did help out during the war all thought they should have been allowed to go to the war front too, because they wanted to help just as much as the boys did. Well, Helen had read in the paper that Dorothea Dix was accepting women to be nurses. And all of her friends thought she would be perfect to help with this. So Helen took her little daughter Hattie over to her mother-in-law and went to Washington, where she met Dorothea Dix, the superintendent of female nurses. Well, Dorothea took one look at her and says, "You're not coming in my hospital. I want people over the age of 30. I'm not having you come look for a new husband here." But Dorothea's requirements were that you be plain looking and that you have references from 3 different people saying that you were a responsible, sober, moral person. And one reference had to be from your minister. Well, I've got the picture of Helen here, right at the beginning. And she would have made an excellent nurse. She probably could have been an assistant in her father's blacksmith shop. And she looked around Miss Dix's office, and there were piles of papers on all the desks. Miss Dix was in the Army office, and the women she hired were paid by the Army Corps. And Helen saw all this paper, and she was just so enthused to help out, do something to help with the war effort. So she offered to do the correspondence for Miss Dix and get rid of some of this paper that's sitting all over her desk that she has no time for. So Miss Dix took her up on that. Helen had attended Miss Merrill's finishing school and could write very neatly, and so she was very good at helping Miss Dix. And Miss Dix was very impressed with Helen, and it was very hard to work with Miss Dix. Most people had called her Dragon Dix, but Helen got along with everyone, and after a year and a half, she convinced Miss Dix that she could be a nurse. So she was assigned to Campbell Hospital on 6th Street in Washington. This has been an old cavalry barracks, and there were 11 wards with 3,000 beds, 30,000 beds, no. Okay. The old cavalry barracks had 600 beds. At the start of the war, there had only been one hospital in Washington. By the end of the war, they had 16 hospitals with 30,000 beds, plus other tents and other buildings had been taken over and used. Miss Dix had prescribed a uniform for all the nurses to wear, a dark uniform, no ruffles, ribbons, bows, no hoops. You weren't going to be able to work if you were sashaying around in your hoop. She didn't want you to wear a corset because you weren't been flexible enough to do all the work that was needed. The uniforms were to have white collars and white cuffs, and these were just basted on the edge of the dress so that you could take them off and wash them and look fresh and clean in the morning. You were to wear an apron with 2 pockets so you had room for your supplies. And you were to have something on your head. Every hospital had a different type of head covering, and this is the Brittany bonnet. It's a very old-fashioned bonnet from the 1700s, keeping the hair off of your neck and out of your face as you worked. But the main purpose was to keep the lice and bugs out of your hair, because the men had been camped out in the fields for months on end, not very many places to bathe, and whatever they brought into the hospital, the nurses were exposed to. Then the duties of the nurses at this time were not what you would consider nursing today. They would feed the patients, bathe the patients, read to them, write letters, keep them entertained. You could play cards and checkers, and they would sing to the patients. The nurses would get together in groups and have a music hour and keep the men entertained. And the doctors didn't think the women actually had much to offer when they came to the hospital. Before the war, through centuries, wounded soldiers were expendable. You could just go out and recruit new ones and not worry about all these sick and wounded and when they might ever return to help you. But the American women were seeing their husbands and their brothers laying there and no one there to help except other recovering soldiers. So the women stepped forward, were paid, the women that worked for Miss Dix were paid $11 a month, and they served in the larger hospitals back in the East. They weren't on battlefields. There were other nurses who volunteered with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and they would be stationed back in some of the cities after a battle on the field hospital area, and they would take care of the patients there. But they didn't really do a whole lot of medical there either. They had stewards in the hospitals, and the doctors didn't allow them to take over their field. In Washington, Helen met the president and his family. Mr. Lincoln liked to visit the sick and would come day or night. He hoped to cheer the wounded. And Helen thought Mrs. Lincoln was a very lovable woman. She came every week with baskets of flowers and candies and fruit. One day, Helen was working in the hospital and Lincoln came in. He always liked to talk to the soldiers and boost their morale. He wished he could help. He was always so good and kind. Well, he strolled into the hospital one day and spied some strawberry shortcake on the table and cut himself a big chunk and sat in the corner on the floor and ate that. No one had the heart to tell him that that was for the wounded boys who had been out in the field and had no access to luxuries, where Lincoln could have eaten that at his table at home. But they let him have his strawberry shortcake. Helen was taking dictation from a captain one day, and next to the cot nearby was a little drummer boy. And Helen covered him up, and in walked Lincoln, and he saw that little boy on the cot, and he goes, "Oh, my little man, you did not have to go to war. Aren't you sorry that you are here now?" And the boy, with great efforts, tells Mr. Lincoln, "Oh no, if I had 100 lives to give, I would give them all to this flag." At that point, Mr. Lincoln was called away, and when he returned, the little boy had died. And Mr. Lincoln picked up the boy, the body and kissed him, and with tears running down his face, he says, "Oh God, please make me as true to this flag as this little drummer boy was loyal." Helen took care of Willie and Tad when they were ill. She was at the White House helping. And after Mr. Lincoln was assassinated, she was comforting Tad, and Tad goes, "Oh, nurse, I miss Pa so. You know, if Pa was alive today, he would forgive the man who killed him." So after the war, Helen had worked in Memphis with the African veterans, and she worked in Syracuse, New York with the unfortunate women. These were the unmarried mothers. When she was out east, she did have her daughter Hattie come live with her. And then her parents became ill. Well, Hattie did meet someone out east and get married. So Hattie stayed in the east, and Helen went back to Sheboygan Falls. And in 1901, her mother died. And 3 months later, her daughter died out east. And then a year later, her father died. He was 92 years old, but he worked in his blacksmith shop well into his 80s. Now, some of the things that the doctors had, which during the war, they always wanted to use chloroform and ether if they were doing a surgery. You didn't want people flailing around and you would cut somewhere else that wasn't supposed to be cut. They had laudanum and morphine for pain, and laudanum is just whiskey with opium mixed in. You could pick this up at your general store if you were addicted to it afterwards. That it was very commonly available to everyone. They had quinine for malaria. Things like measles and chickenpox just swept through the men. The men were from rural areas and had never been exposed to these things. So whole companies would come down. Well, if the nurses were exposed and had never had it, they took ill too. Cholera and typhoid. Cholera is from the water. There were 4 microscopes in the Army. They were all in Washington, so the doctors really didn't have access to them. People used them more as just an entertainment, and they'd look at a slide of water, and there were little things swimming in their water. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, but they thought these little atom animals lived in water and belonged there. They didn't know that these were the things causing disease. It's been recorded that over 620,000 men died during the war. 2/3 of these men just died from the diseases, not from battlefield. Being in camp was worse than being out in a battle. Diarrhea was the #1 killer during the war. In the South, because of the blockade, they couldn't get supplies, but every camp had horses, and they found that the horsehair was very good for suturing wounds, especially facial wounds where you needed something very small. But this was coarse and would pull on your skin, so they would boil the horsehair to make it more flexible. Well, they soon found that people who were sutured with horsehair were recovering faster than people who had been sutured with their regular surgery thread. It wasn't until after the war that they discovered that because they had boiled it, they had sterilized it, and the suture threads that the doctor had been using, it would lay out on the table. They'd take a piece off, flies would land on it, and then they'd take the next piece off. Germs were a theory. There was, if it was so small you couldn't see it, how was it going to hurt you? And we have a nurse up here cringing. And this is the mini ball that came out of the muskets. It's made out of lead, and lead is a very soft material. When the gunpowder would ignite, it would create heat, and it would make the lead very soft, so when it would hit you, it would flatten out. And so it would go into your wound as a .58 caliber, but it was much larger when they wanted to try and remove it. If it shattered your bone, there was no way to replace it, so amputation was the most efficient way and the thing that would cause the patient the least amount of pain. And 75% of the people who had amputations lived. The lower down in your extremity that you had gotten hit, the better the chances were that you would survive this. Remember, there's no blood transfusions, and these people are recovering. No antibiotics to give them. And it was just amazing how strong these men were. When the men were marching, they were given 3 hardtack crackers, some salt pork, and some coffee. There's no nutrition in that. That's one of the reasons they couldn't fight off disease, was they had not enough nutrients in their body to fight. People who had gotten in the prisons came down with scurvy real fast because of just from their previous diet, and then when they got to the prisons, the diets were even worse. The scurvy would make your teeth fall out, it would give you night blindness, and eventually you would die from it. And the bandages that the doctors used were just a cotton bandage wrapped around. Early in the war, only the doctors and the stewards would take care of the bandaging. But as the war went on, the doctors did realize that the women were capable of doing more, that they were doing a lot of good for the patients. And there were so many more wounded than anybody ever expected, so that the women really were needed. But they would take the bandages off, throw them in a pan of cold water to get the blood out, then send them to the laundry to be boiled and hung in the sun to dry, and then they re-rolled and used them again. Is there any questions? Anything else you want to know about that I can try and answer?
How many years was this lady a nurse after the war?
Helen? Oh, just a few, well, probably about 30 years afterwards, until she went back to Sheboygan Falls to take care of her parents. Most nurses didn't last very long, a couple of months, and they had come down with some of the diseases, the typhoid fever and cholera. Even the doctors were susceptible to them. There were 336 doctors that died during the war. 32 were killed in action. 9 died from accidents. 4 died in a prison. Some would die from yellow fever and cholera. After Helen was back in Sheboygan Falls and her parents were gone, she moved to Sheboygan to the Grand Hotel. And she would sit in the lobby and talk to people who were visiting in Sheboygan, or her friends would drop by. And she would tell stories of her days in Washington. She had met John Greenleaf Whittier, Charles Dickens, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the Grants, General McPherson. And after the war, Oliver Wendell Holmes and Teddy Roosevelt. 3 weeks before the assassination of Lincoln, she had been sitting playing whist with John Wilkes Booth and several patients, and she just couldn't believe that Mr. Booth had such evil intentions in his mind. John and his brother Ed had come to entertain the men in the wards quite often, and they were always very civil and kind to the wounded. And she just couldn't believe that of John, that he would kill someone. And then later, after the war, she did attend the wedding of Ed Booth's daughter out east. So she had met a lot of marvelous people. She really had a fantastic life. In 1925, she was heard to say, "As long as God gives me strength, I want to work for the boys in the blue." So she attended all the Civil War veterans gatherings, the Sons of the Union Veterans. She was president of the Daughter of the Veterans. She was secretary of the National Association of Army Nurses of the Civil War. She wrote a history of the Civil War nurses, and I haven't found a copy, and I don't know anybody that has a copy of this. I mean, it would be a wealth of information for us. And she would travel all over Wisconsin and talk about her experiences as a nurse, and she was well known everywhere. In 1927, she was receiving a pension from the U.S. government for her war work. And most people don't think women had any connection with the Army at all, but these women that were hired by Dorothea Dix, and Dorothea hired between 2,000 and 3,000 women, and they were all with the Army Corps. In 1931, she fell at the hotel and fractured her hip. Her granddaughter was visiting from out east, and she was so excited, she just didn't feel any pain and went through the day, and the next morning when she woke up, she had to be taken to the hospital, and they found that she had fractured her hip. And a month later, she died. She was 93 years old. She was given a military funeral. They played taps at her funeral, and they shot off the 21-gun salute. If you go down to Sheboygan, on the corner of Calumet and Martin Avenue, there is a rock memorial dedicated to the women of the Civil War, all the nurses. And it says, "In memory of Helen B. Cole, the last of the Wisconsin Civil War nurses, she gave the rarest gift of all, herself, to help build these organizations." Thank you.
Is she buried there in Sheboygan Falls?
She's buried in Sheboygan Falls by the Kohler Sheboygan Falls Cemetery, and I've walked through there and I haven't found it. Because we do the Civil War program at Kohler, right across the street in the park. And no, I've looked on that Find a Grave, and it tells me what number, but then nothing's numbered when you get over to the cemetery. So
Your uniform, did you try to, I'm sure you didn't have a pattern, but did you try to simulate it to the best you could based on photographs or?
Oh, yeah, there's patterns in Godey's Ladies magazines and things, and so they are patterns from the 1860s. And Miss Dix's nurses wore the dark uniforms. The ladies who were volunteering came with their calico print dresses and whatever else that they had, but you just couldn't wear a hoop or anything fancy around there. You were there to work, and you worked a 12-hour day, 6 days a week.
And what was the fabric?
It's cotton.
It was cotton.
Yeah.
Nancy, what became of her husband?
William Cole, he died from consumption when Helen was only 23 years old.
Okay.
And consumption is what we consider tuberculosis today. Yeah, it would, consumption would consume your body and you'd just wither away. So that was where they came up with the name for that.
Of course, she never remarried them, that you're aware of?
Not that we're aware of. There was, she did have, there's one account that she did marry, but nobody ever found a record of that. And then there was never any mention of that man again. And she always went by the name of Helen Cole. So she would not have stayed with that name if she had ever remarried.
Does she have an obituary like yours?
Oh, yeah, in the Sheboygan Falls. I've got copies of it here in my papers if you need.
Was it in the Sheboygan Falls papers? Or?
It was in several papers. There is just a wealth of information on her. Yeah, this. extremely long obituary on her. And people wrote in and said just wonderful things. They had known her. Oh, I don't know. I just have so many notes on. I mean, there's so much written on her in this area, just from the local newspapers over and over.
Do you happen to know, or maybe nobody has figured it out, but the percentage of women who served as nurses, how many of them made it back home to a normal life again? Or
Oh, most of them, yeah. Most of them
most of
came.
them came home?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Some of them came back in just a couple of months because they just couldn't take the heat and the long hours of working and the exposure to the different things. Louisa May Alcott had gotten typhoid fever. That cut her life short too. She worked 3 months and came home. And
They were putting their lives on the line too.
yeah, they didn't realize that though when they took off and what was going to be involved. So I'll turn it back over to Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for a very wonderful and very informational
Oh, was it? Okay.
presentation. Thank you very
I'm not
much.
used to